You're a Soviet submarine captain at periscope depth, and the only light is red. Through the periscope, an American warship fills the crosshairs, and she must never know you're there. This is the Cold War at its peak, and you command the boats the West fears most. You can vanish under the Arctic ice for months. On some of these boats, if you believe you're under attack, firing a nuclear weapon needs no order from Moscow, only two men turning two halves of one key. So here's the question every man who held your seat faced. What do you do when the reactor behind you starts to melt, and there's no one left to ask? This is the job. You spend months at a time sealed inside a steel tube, breathing air that has been scrubbed and recycled for weeks on end. Above you, American destroyers hunt for the sound of your propeller. Below you sits a nuclear reactor that must never fail, and missiles that could each carry a city's death. The path to this seat ran through years of naval schools and slow promotion, navigator, then executive officer, then command. The men who actually sat here didn't train for their worst days. They lived them. 5 of those days made it into the record. This is the first. July 1961. You are Nikolai Zateyev, captain of the first rank, and your boat is the newest weapon in the Soviet fleet, the Soviet Union's first nuclear submarine built to carry ballistic missiles. On the 4th of July, deep in the North Atlantic off the coast of Greenland, an alarm tells you the pressure in the starboard reactor's cooling line has dropped to 0. A pipe has failed somewhere you cannot reach. Without coolant, the reactor's temperature begins to climb, and it does not stop. It rises toward 800 degrees, close to the point where the fuel itself melts. You drop the control rods. It changes nothing. And when you reach for the long-range radio to call Moscow, you find it dead. There is no backup cooling system. The designers left the space for one and never installed it, so there is no switch to flip, no second pump to start. If the fuel melts down, there is no system built into the boat that can stop it. Your only option is to build a cooling line by hand, inside the compartment where the radiation is already lethal. You send men in, 7 of the engineering crew and their young officer, to weld a water pipe into the reactor system. Before Lieutenant Boris Korchalov goes through the hatch, you speak to him. Your own account records what you said. You asked him if he knew where he was going. He answered, "I know, comrade captain." And you told him, "Go with God." The jury rig works. The temperature falls. The boat is saved. But the men who saved it have taken doses of radiation the human body cannot survive. Your own account describes them coming out of that compartment. Within 2 hours their skin reddened and swelled, their faces puffed until the eyes would not open, and dots of blood appeared beneath the hair. You wrote that they could no longer be recognized. All 8 died within 3 weeks, the first after 6 days, the last after 19. Over the next 2 years the toll climbed toward 22. Radioactive gas had been pulled into the ventilation and spread through the boat, dosing every man aboard. The crew gave her a name that stuck. They called her Hiroshima. Now change boats, and change the mood entirely. October 1981. You are the captain of a small diesel submarine in the Baltic, and you have just run your boat hard aground on rocks off the southern coast of Sweden. Not in open water. You have grounded roughly 10 kilometers from Karlskrona, one of Sweden's largest naval bases. Inside a restricted military zone, your boat threaded past a maze of islands and straits to reach. When the Swedes arrive and ask how a Soviet submarine ended up parked at their front door, you explain that your navigation equipment failed. All of it. At once. In the one stretch of the entire Baltic coast where you should never be. The Western press dubs it whiskey on the rocks, and the joke writes itself. For 10 days, the boat sits stuck on the rocks while the two governments shout at each other across it. In secret, Swedish technicians point radiation detectors at your hull from a passing patrol boat and pick up a signature they believe can only be uranium from a nuclear warhead tucked in the port torpedo tube. The political officer will later admit there were nuclear torpedoes aboard and orders to destroy the boat rather than let the Swedes seize it. A storm blows in. 2 ships from the Soviet fleet cross Sweden's territorial line, and the Prime Minister gives his commander 3 words: hold the border. Then the weather breaks, the shouting cools, and Swedish tugs simply drag you off the rocks and hand you back. Nobody fires. Nobody dies. You just go home, famous for all the wrong reasons. Back to the nuclear fleet, and back to a real emergency. October 1986. You are Captain Igor Britanov, 2nd rank, on a missile submarine patrolling the Atlantic about 1,000 kilometers northeast of Bermuda. Roughly 120 men aboard. At 14 minutes past 5 in the morning, water begins dripping from the cap of missile tube. Number 6. A seal has failed, and the sea is forcing its way into a silo that holds a liquid-fueled ballistic missile. Seawater and rocket propellant should never meet. When they do, they react, throwing off clouds of poison gas and enough heat to tear the tube apart. You order the boat up and the silo pumped dry. It is not fast enough. At 38 minutes past 5, tube number 6 explodes. The explosion and the fire kill men instantly. including the weapons officer who tried to save the tube. Poison gas fills the compartments, and now the reactor will not shut down. The heat has warped the mechanism that drops the control rods, so they will not fall on command. Someone has to go into the reactor chamber and lower them by hand. 2 men go in, an officer named Belikov and a 20-year-old seaman named Sergei Preminin. They force 3 of the 4 rods down. Then Belikov collapses in the heat and is dragged out, and Preminin goes back alone to seat the last rod against holders the heat has bent out of shape. He does it. He shuts the reactor down by hand. But the pressure has changed on the far side of the hatch, and he cannot get it open. The log records that Sergei Preminin died in that compartment alone, having just saved everyone still breathing on the other side of the door. Preminin was 20 years old. Years later, his country made him a hero of the Russian Federation. The boat itself never made it home. The surviving crew were taken off. A Soviet merchant ship rigged a tow line, and on the 6th of October the line parted and the submarine went down. She sank nearly 4 miles to the floor of the Atlantic, and settled there, taking more than a dozen missiles and their nuclear warheads into the dark with her. They are still down there. Now the worst case, the one the whole job exists to prevent. October 1962, the day of the Cuban Missile Crisis that came to be called Black Saturday. You are deep in the Atlantic aboard a diesel submarine near the American blockade, out of contact with Moscow for days, with no way to know whether the war has already started. Your batteries are nearly flat, the air conditioning has failed, the heat keeps rising, and men are collapsing at their posts. Then the explosions begin. American ships are dropping small charges to force you up, but you cannot know that. Down here it sounds like you are being sunk. You decide this is the attack, and you give the order to ready the nuclear torpedo. On this boat, that order needs 3 senior officers to agree. 2 of you say yes. The 3rd refuses and will not be moved. He is right. The charges are signals, not an attack, and he has just talked the boat back from firing a nuclear weapon at the United States Navy. The torpedo is never armed to launch. The submarine surfaces into the night, is watched by the Americans, and is ordered home. No one is hurt. Nothing is fired. And the world goes on without ever knowing how close it came, because the story stays buried for 40 years. When it finally surfaces, one American who studies it calls that 3rd officer the man who saved the world. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. So far you have survived your own boat. Now the Cold War asks the opposite of you. Go hunt theirs. March 1984, the Sea of Japan. You command a nuclear attack submarine, and your orders are to shadow an American aircraft carrier, the Kitty Hawk, close and unseen. You shadow her, close and quiet. Then bad weather swallows her, and you lose the contact. You come up to periscope depth to find her again, and when you raise the scope she is there, 4 or 5 kilometers away and closing fast, both of you driving at the same patch of sea. The order to dive comes too late. Your submarine strikes the carrier and rolls onto her back in the water. A second strike shears off one of your propeller blades and leaves it buried in the American hull. The carrier sails on, barely scratched. You do not. Your boat is crippled, and you have to be towed home. And sometimes you win. Spring 1987. 5 Soviet attack submarines slip out of their northern base and turn for the Atlantic coast of North America. Instead of the usual path, where American underwater microphones wait to catch them, they take the long way around Greenland to stay silent. When the West realizes the Atlantic approaches are full of Soviet submarines it cannot pin down, it throws everything it has into the hunt. British patrol planes burn through an entire year's supply of sonar buoys chasing ghosts. It takes about 8 days just to find 4 of the 5. That is the boat you command at its peak. Not the disaster below the waterline, but the silence. And what the silence did to the fleets that thought they owned the Atlantic. So, what was it actually like to command a Soviet nuclear submarine at the height of the Cold War? It was to hold enough nuclear firepower to erase cities, and to be one failed seal, one bent control rod, one misread depth charge away from losing your crew, or your world. The enemy was rarely the Americans on the surface. It was the boat itself, the reactor with no backup, the missile fuel that hated the sea, the machine that would kill its own crew long before it ever reached a target. The men who held your seat were not the villains the West imagined. Some of them saved cities they would never see by refusing to fire, or by walking into a reactor so the rest could live. One of those boats is still on the seabed today, warheads and all, exactly where she went down. That was the life. One order could end your crew, and one refusal could save the world. But one Soviet boat was built for the deep, a single titanium submarine that dove deeper than any combat submarine in history, into water that would crush an ordinary hull, until the fire that finally sent her to the bottom. That is the seat you take next time.